Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
Hello, you're listening to the podcast. So there I was. This is episode number 157, The Longest Rescue.
Ooh, and it was long.
How long, repeat? How long was this rescue?
7.5 years.
Let's just call it
103 days.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is truly a very humbling and amazing interview with a POW survivor.
The longest held American enlisted POW in American history.
His name is Bill Robinson, and he was a crew chief on a rescue helicopter. And I'm telling you what, we talked to him for damn near 2 hours. Right?
Didn't you have the stars to get on that thing?
it was a UH-43, which if you look it up, it's terrifying. It's, we're terrified from helicopters anyway. This thing is truly like a egg beater.
No tail rotor, upside down egg beater with like left and right rotors, not fore and aft,
right?
like the
and
46.
They counter rotated, trying to tear each other apart. Oh
right.
My God! Yeah. Well, anyway, they didn't crash; they were actually shot down.
Yeah, we've got a couple show business items we need to chat about real quickly. First of all, we talked about him last week, and his call sign instead of Racket is actually Stealth,
which is
Navy air crew. Yeah. So Stealth sent us $50. Great reason. Yeah. We're going to try and get him on the show and tell us how he got the call sign Stealth. So that's good.
Well, thank you, Stealth.
Yeah. Sal Marinello lost all sense of financial responsibility.
God bless you, Marine. What in the hell is wrong with you?
Yeah, right.
But we love you. He just threw another $100 at us. Thank you, Sal. Very, very humbling.
New Patreon pilot this week is Brett Ross. Oh, come on, Fig.
Betsy.
Got to do it.
How could it not be Betsy?
Right. Betsy, thanks for your support. We are deeply appreciative of that. So, and then Mike Evans sent us a one-time donation of $100. Actually, it was $178, but it's New Zealand dollars, so it translates to 100 here. So thanks for that $178 there, Mike Evans. Call sign?
Linda
Evans.
After the actress? Yeah. Linda Evans. Thank you, Linda.
We're showing our age, Fig.
Whoa.
Yeah. This show is happily brought to you by Robert.Walling at nm.com. We say Robbie in the show because that's his name, but I got to get back and change that in the show. It's Robert.Walling at nm.com. Thank you, Robbie at HSI Wealth Strategies. Give Robbie a call. Don't be
a moron. Call Robbie.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. He'll help you out. He'll help you not be a moron.
Wow.
So some more stuff here about Bill Robinson. What a fun show. As I think we said this to each other as we got off the recording when we did this was, we knew we'd start this and we'd get some good stories. We had no idea.
Right.
The gravity that some of these shows would have. Oh my goodness.
Right. One of my biggest takeaways, honestly, at the end of the day, and I was processing this whole thing, was how absolutely loving and what a great attitude this guy has. Not a sour bone in his body.
No. He's been back. He's met his captors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is also truly another amazing story. In the mid-90s, he went back there.
Right. He was actually a Vietnamese postage stamp. They used the picture, the cover of his book, The Longest Rescue, by Bill Robinson. That picture that's on the cover was used to make a Vietnamese postage stamp. So,
and I don't want to ruin this, but in his first 3 days as being a captive, it was the third day was the pivotal point. And when he told us that story, it's one of those hair on your arms, hair on the back of your neck.
Yeah. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
I know, right?
Wow. And I'm not kidding. I mean, it's like, oh, yeah, it was, right. You're going to have to listen to that. But he was like,
I mean, yeah. And the breadth of the stories, the different things, that transpired over that time. And then,
he had to have an appendectomy while he was a POW.
Yeah.
The only way to get their attention was to go on a hunger strike.
Yeah, because they treated the prisoners like animals, and like any.
When your dog doesn't eat, something's wrong. Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. And what a great ending, so to speak, to his career. The way it ended, which was also a great story. Anyway, you are really going to love this.
Truly, this is not a superlative. A great American. Proud to call him a brother in arms, and feel very small and humble next to him.
Yeah, no kidding. And what a absolute honor it was for him to share his story.
Let's say we get out of the way and share it with you now.
Don't sit on that collective of the egg beater.
Yeah, stay away from it.
About crossing the pond.
It'll hurt you.
At night, in the world's smallest cockpit, on the tanker, through the weather. Oh, and to the tanker crew who did that, thanks a lot. We really appreciated that. I'm just kidding. No, I'm not. Well, there I was, crossing the pond, and you could see that I wasn't exactly fond.
And there we were on the 20th of September 1965 on a rescue mission over North Vietnam. We had dropped down below the crowds and we were homing in on the pilot who was down on the ground. Unfortunately, as we approached, we started taking small arms fire. And unfortunately, the A-1Es that were our escort to fire suppression, they took a hit in the rocket pod. And the last transmission I heard over the radio during that activity was a unauthorized disposal of your ordnance in the local area. That's when I would think a pilot would have a bad radio and understand he had to do something else. But not only did he roll off to accommodate the rules, but his wingman went with him, and there we were standing there in the middle of a rescue, and no firepower to assist. And the next thing you know, that once they rolled out, then the whole world broke loose, and I might say, and then we started taking hits. Fortunate for us, we were on a hillside, and they were shooting down from above us. And like I said, above us was the transmission, the rotor heads, and the blades of the helicopter, and they took most of the hits rather than us. And once it hit the fuel control, the airplane sputtered, and I'm here to report that the wooden blades on the H-43 rescue helicopter is no match for bamboo. And we fell 90 feet onto the jungle floor. And things started from there.
And that is how all terrifying.
It happened so fast that you didn't have time to pucker.
Didn't have time to pucker. Already have a show title there, I think. Greetings, everyone. Repeat here, coming to you from New Hampshire. My co-host, Fig. Where are you today, sir?
I'm home for one more day. And
nice.
It is in Kearney, Missouri, God's country. And it is our distinct pleasure and honor to welcome Bill Robinson to So There I Was.
It is
sir.
Indeed.
Thank you.
It is. Bill Robinson, let me just quickly give this, the author of the book, The Longest Rescue, and what you just heard is the beginning of the beginning and the end of The Longest Rescue, as it were. Holy smokes, the longest held American enlisted POW in American history. Mr. Robinson, first of all, as we try to express pre-show, and words will never convey our deep gratitude to you and for what you endured for this country. It brings me practically to tears just thinking about it. So first of all, let me open by saying thank you for your service. May God bless you. You have endured more than any human being should have to for their country, and we are deeply grateful for you.
Did.
Wow. Okay. Let's back up a little though and lighten it up some. How'd you wind up on a helicopter? What made you go into the Air Force? What made you want to be working around airplanes? All that good stuff.
All that good stuff. Well, I grew up in an era. I used to tell folks that I was speaking to older groups, and I would try to identify with older groups, and I would tell them that, I had mentioned that I was a baby boomer, and then one lady come up to me one day and says, "You realize you're not a baby boomer?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, you're baby boomers 45 to 55, and said you were born in 43." And so I had to come up with a new title, so I was actually a weekend pass out of World War II.
The Weekend Pass. All right, there's another show title.
So, and, of course, I grew up everywhere we went, the church or wherever we went, there was always someone there wearing a uniform. And my family members would point out to say someday it would be my turn, that for being born in the freest nation on earth, and there comes a certain amount of responsibility, and that is to make sure it remains free. So I was conditioned from an early age, especially when I was about 8 or 9 years old. My grandfather took me down to the cotton mill where he worked. And over in one corner of the cotton mill was a plexiglass wall, and behind it, to me, was just name after name after name. After we sat there and looked at it for a while, my grandfather broke the silence, and he said, "These are the ones that, when our nation was attacked in 1941, they raised their right hand and said, 'Take me. I want to defend America.'" We talked about some of the names on that wall, my father, my uncle, and several of my senior cousins. And, some of them I knew had been in the war, but not to the extent that I would learn that day, and some of them carried injuries. And we talked about the different folks in the neighborhood that also served this country and came home and went back in the cotton mill like nothing had ever happened, and I learned that day why Rufus had a limp. He had taken a bullet and destroyed his knee. So life goes on. And as we were looking at it, I noticed that some of the names had stars beside them. And finally, I asked my grandfather, I says, "What does that star stand for?" Kind of with a lump in his throat and a tear in his eyes, he said, "They're the ones that made the ultimate sacrifice for the freedoms that we enjoy every day." You think about my generation, we have a wall with over 58,000 stars on it of those who made the ultimate sacrifice. We leave it sometimes at that, but we still have 1,500 missing in action. But the real kicker to it all is that, that on that wall, 39,000 of those youngsters are 22 years of age or younger. Mm. And then 36,000 of them are 19 years of age or younger. As we stay here this time of the year, we're listening to the kids talking about their senior trip. Well, a lot of Vietnam veterans' senior trip was to Vietnam.
Yeah.
Some were killed on the first day, and some were killed on the last day. And they see this, and so there's still a question is how many actually served in and out of the war, and sometimes I like to stick with this 7 million, with over 4 million serving in country or in areas of service to Vietnam. And so, this an important thing.
Sure.
Personally, when I came of age, I wanted to join the military. I didn't think I was college material at that particular point in my life, so I had to figure out a way to make a living. So, this was probably a good thing. And, of course, I was conditioned for it from the day one that this would be my responsibility, as I was an able-bodied 18-year-old. So the day I turned 18, I went down and signed up for the draft and went straight to the Air Force recruiter's office. I had talked to him before, but the only way I could get in at that particular point would have my father or someone in the family to sign for me, and I just didn't want to put that burden on anyone. So I waited till I was 18 to go down and sign my own papers and let it be at that. And of course, that's one of the things I learned, that, I guess that all of us that served in the military, the first thing we learn is recruiters, weathermen, politicians, and used car salesmen that all graduated from the same school.
Yeah.
'Cause he-
Tell you just about anything you want to hear, right?
Yeah, he said, I wanted to go in. He said, when you want to go in? I said, now. He says, no, let's need November. And I said, well, if I'm going to have to wait till November, I might as well go to January. And he said, no. He said, you got a better chance of getting what you want if you go in November. Of course, reality was he knew he had already filled his quota for September, October, and December and January. So he
Trying to make his November numbers now.
Yeah.
And
So Bill, why the Air Force? Why not the Marine Corps, for crying out loud?
Right? Yeah. What were you thinking?
I thought about that, and it didn't take me long to think of something else. I was, I had a.
Okay, I almost spit my drink out over that.
I thought Repeat was going to shoot beer out of his nostrils
One of
there for a
my
second.
favorite cousins was in the Marine Corps at the time, and he got out and taught school for about 2 years and had to go back in the Marine Corps to get his sanity back, and so. Most of my family went in the Navy. I lived near Newport News, and a lot of them ended up in the Navy. And I just decided, well, my brother-in-law, and now he's ex-brother-in-law, but he was in the Air Force, and then we had a little Air Force detachment there where I grew up, and so that blue suit kind of looked cute in the neighborhood, and so
Chicks dig it.
and so I decided that's what I wanted to do, and aircraft maintenance was, I talked about the motor pool, but like I said, I want to be a little bit more sophisticated, so I decided to work on airplanes, and I was qualified, and I left left in November, going to basic training, and went through part of the basic training at Lackland, and then moved up to Shepherd Air Force Base, and we completed second phase of our basic training, and also started helicopter maintenance school, and once I completed that, then they came in, and of course I'm sure you guys remember there was what we used to call a dream shoot. That's when they came in and said, "Where would you like to go?" And I said, my brother-in-law had talked about Alaska so much, I thought that would be a great place to go. So I volunteered for Alaska, and 3 of my classmates went to Alaska, and I went to Altus, Oklahoma. So
how the hell did that work? That's not.
how did this one work out for you? And
That's not the middle of nowhere, but you can see it from there, right? Holy
it's
cow.
12 miles to Texas on the west side and on the south side, and and there's good walking distance. But
Good golly.
and it was a SAC base and had to be SAC massaged, and they kind of conditioned me that you would stay here till you died or retired, and I said, well, it's next thing I know, I have an assignment to Osan, Korea. And of course, I found out that being a helicopter crew chief assigned to a B-52 wing supporting the Atlas missiles, you didn't stand a chance in the totem pole of life, so I'm off to Korea, and after I got to Korea, the next thing you know, the tour went rather rapidly, 13 months, somewhere in there. They said, well, you got to fill out another dream sheet. So I filled it out very carefully. I just wrote anywhere USA on it. And lo and behold, next thing, before the ink was dry, I was in the chief's office and explaining to why my thing. And I told him, well, it didn't work out very well last time. And of course, he had to give me all the stuff that goes along with it. Well, you're coming off a remote tour. You got a 75% chance of getting the base you want, and you got a 85% chance of getting the state you want, and 95% chance of getting the area you want. So with his guiding hands, and I filled out my dream sheet, including Seymour Johnson in North Carolina, state of Florida, and Southeast as my recommendations. And so meanwhile, he rotated back to the States, and my assignment came down in Grand Forks, North Dakota. So I knew the Air Force that I was doing real well in communicating at that particular point. And
that's just like the southeastern United States, except without all that heat and humidity.
Yeah.
That's almost in Canada, is it not?
Well, the only thing is a picket fence between there and the North Pole, and it sits right on the Canadian U.S. line.
Oh man!
And
holy cow!
And so, and then when I arrived there, they said, "Did you get the word?" And I said, "What's the word?" And he said, "Well, our detachment is closing. You need to think about where you'd like to go from here." Well, at that point, I was ready to go to the house, but this thing called Southeast Asia started to pipe up on the internet. Like I said, we never even heard the word Vietnam. It was all Indochina. And
so Bill, if I'm trying to do the math in my head here, so did you enlist in like about 1962 or
that's fall of 61?
Yeah,
he turned 18, 43, 63.
Yeah, I went in 61, November 61. In fact, I went in on the 22nd of November, 1961.
Month before I was born.
And yeah, you're just a youngster then, aren't you?
Well, we're a generation behind you, and I've found it very interesting. Fig, I know you're in the same boat as me. The people you grew up around, there was all this service mentality. It was kind of expected that if you were healthy, you would go in the military. And then, of course, by the mid to late 70s, that started waning a lot. In fact, I seriously considered, I don't think I want to go in. And Hal Hawkins, God rest his soul, A7 driver in the Navy. I was at a winging party in Beeville, Texas, and Hal Hawkins said, "No, let me tell you something. Think about all the freedoms that you have in this country, and you need to pay that back." And I went, "Oh, crap." Right. Oh. So, yeah.
And then there's that.
There's that, yeah.
Oh, and there's that.
But I find it so interesting that in today's day and age, like we went to a friend's baptism. It's been 20 years ago now. And there was me and one other guy there that had gone in the service. Everybody else, it's that whole mentality is gone. So I find it so interesting how, you grew up around that and you felt obligated, and I'm grateful you did. And I'm same time, I'm sorry you did, because spoiler alert, I know what he went through. No, I don't. I don't know what you went through. Let me rephrase that.
We know how the story goes.
We know how the story goes.
How the story
goes.
No concept of what you went through, but we're getting there. So
everybody doesn't get the bad apple. That's the sad thing. It's a good thing, I guess you might say. I have the opportunity now as I get older. I speak at the NCO Academy and the Airman Leadership School, and I have a lot of confidence in my youth of this nation that we don't ever get to see. Because if you're good, you don't make the news. If you're bad, you're the front page. And that's the sad part that our young people, our young men and women in uniform, is they don't get the rightful dues and dedication that they show for this country, because we have a group of journalists that just doesn't feel like that the people need to know about these good people. They think the America is made up of all bad people. So that's it.
Yeah, let's pay attention to the knuckleheads.
I know we sit around in our group of old men. Where we say, well, we look at each other and say, we can't die. We don't have anybody to turn the country over to.
Right.
That's about right.
And and I've had the opportunity to speak at high school. One time I spoke at a high school ROTC, and they asked me, how long you want me to speak? He said, about 3 to 5 minutes. They don't have a very long attention span.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
I said, with my southern boy, I won't get much more out of my name.
Right.
I've learned to speed up a little bit since then.
Yeah. So you get to North Dakota, and they're shutting things down. And is that where you cycled into
yes,
Vietnam?
they came in, and like I said, that they were just rescue, which I was part of. Mm-hmm. It's something that, after the Korean War, they decided, well, we don't need rescue anymore. So rescue, which used to be Air Rescue Service, added an extra R into it, and they were ARS, Air Rescue and Recovery Service, and they were chasing balloons. In fact, that's where I was headed back to if I'd have made it back, was the Goodfellow Air Force Base to go chase weather balloons. But but I'm sure I'd had another tour at Vietnam if I'd have made it back. But the Air Force, they wouldn't even give me credit for a long tour. They gave me 10 remotes, so with that and $5, I can get a cup of coffee somewhere,
Unbelievable.
Right. Oh my God.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, let's come back to that.
Yeah. But your job then was crew chief, helicopter crew chief? Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we were the confidence for the pilot. We were willing to fly on anything we worked on, so that gave the pilot a little extra confidence when they'd fly their airplane up and we jump in the back and
yeah, I get that totally.
Yeah, it's like I said,
considering it was a helicopter that Repeat and I are both convinced is trying to kill you at all times. Anyway,
well, yeah, but normally you get home before dark.
Normally. Oh man.
Because having the good headlights on those things.
Oh my gosh! All right, so you got you're not your first choice of any duty stations, and then when you finally get to your duty station that you didn't want to go to, they say, "Oh, by the way, we're closing down, and where do you want to go now?" And then you ended up in Osan, and then from there,
I went back to Grand Forks, and then from Grand Forks, I went back to Nong Kham Phanom, Thailand.
Okay.
So I really didn't make it to Vietnam until 2015. South Vietnam. I was just flying over North Vietnam. We were. And,
so you were based in Thailand.
Yes, in Thailand.
Okay.
Well,
that's where Fast Eddie was based, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple shows back. Okay.
Yeah. Most of the Air Force bombing missions, you want to call them, whatever, were flown out of Thailand. We were denying that we were there, but, like I said, then they finally owned up to, And so rescue, like I said, it had just kind of faded away after the Korean War. And so we really didn't have an airplane to go into combat with. And we took what we call the H-43, which it's an LBR, stood for Local Base Rescue. Probably in some of your filming years ago, you saw a helicopter running up and down the runway with a bottle hanging underneath it, and that was a fire suppression kit. And that was the main mission of this airplane, is that once an airplane run off the end of the runway, they could take that fire bottle, and with two firemen, they'd go in and get as close as to the airplane as safe, and then they'd put the fire bottle down, and then they'd back up, put the two firemen on the ground, and go in and rescue. And H-43 that's what it was really designed for, and we had to turn it into a combat model. And like I said, as most of you know, in the military, you always get the mission long before you get the equipment to do the job with, and so
that is not it.
That is it.
That is it.
That's
H-30.
Okay, so I have a picture of the H-30.
Well, that's 43.
43.
I thought you said 34. I'm dyslexic, so we know what that is. Okay.
Yeah, that's a 43. It's HH-43.
It looks like It looks like there's a window in the back there with a split tail.
Yeah.
So tell us about how that works. I don't see a tail rotor on that particular one. Is that between the tails somewhere?
Kind of like an egg beater, just turned upside down, and then they mess with each other. And
what?
That window in the back, we just take it off for weight purposes, so we didn't have that. And
okay.
And
it helped the lead get in faster and easier.
Yeah, it was at 10,000 feet, it's pretty cool back there. It worked quite well.
Well, did that helicopter have much of a useful load, Bill? I mean, it looks kind of small.
It's a good load. Like
Okay.
I said, once you get into hot weather, no helicopter's got good load. They just,
right.
And
well, I guess so. If you guys were, your main mission in flying out of Thailand was to rescue down pilots, so
right.
you're probably rescuing one or two at the most at a time, right?
Normally one or two. Normally most of the time we are getting one. And fortunate for us, is like I said, that they were flying 300 and 400 miles an hour over target. So if they got hit, they could get away. And normally in a safe area, and all we had to do was, if we had the range, of course, like I said, with this airplane, it wasn't designed for what we were using it for. So we.
Well, of course not. Because the military never had enough money to get what they needed. But I've got a question here. Dizzy pointed out, he said intermeshing rotor. Were those counter rotating rotors?
No, they're just like an egg beater. Like I said, they just kind of mesh. You just take an egg beater and turn it upside down, and just put extensions on them. That's what.
So they. Oh, good Lord!
Oh,
that's
even more terrifying.
The control is that little. You see that little flap on behind the blade there. That controls the whole blade, and the blade is stationary. And that's where you get all your lifting from. You got 4 of those on there.
That's why there's no tail rotor, dude, because it's got counter rotating props.
Counter rotating.
Oh my gosh! Bill, I'm scared shitless just looking at that thing sitting still.
Yeah, we had, like I said, we put a piece of quarter-inch steel underneath the pilot and the co-pilot seat, and we set on our World War II flak vest in the back. You remember World War II were the shingle type flak vest, and if somebody shooting up at you, that's not going to do you any good. So you might as well have your butt seated on it to offer some protection.
Well, keep the important parts.
we introduced the first in-flight refueling in helicopters, because we didn't have the range we needed, and so basically we started stacking 55-gallon barrels, and we could depend on what the range was, we'd have.
How long were these missions from Thailand to North Vietnam?
Pardon me?
How long were the missions that when you took off from Thailand and made it up into Vietnam? Vietnam.
Sometimes they could do 4 hours, like I said.
So you were carrying a 55-gallon drum in the helicopter to refuel while you're going?
Yeah, we did quick disconnection of the garden hose. Basically, it was, we just, like I said, that in the Air Force unofficial history, I get credit for a couple of bombing runs over North Vietnam with a 55-gallon barrel, because basically what we would do is, once the fuel drained into the tank, and we'd recover the quick disconnection the garden hose and kept the barrel out the back, so that would give us more room. And then,
when you first told me that on the pre-chat, I understood it, but now I really understand
how my God! My jaw up off the floor for a second. I am processing what I just heard you say, and this is truly amazing.
Yeah.
Well, it was better than landing and have to hand pump it into the airplane.
Well, there's that. Holy smokes!
We've done a little of that too,
So did you get credit for the first helicopter in-flight refueling?
As far as we know, like I said, it was developed by the group we were with. Like I said, it just we ended up finally they found a couple of self-sealing fuel tanks, and of course, 55-gallon barrel is not self-sealing either. So so we didn't have self-sealing tanks on the thing. So if one bullet could drain all of it.
Yeah, the H-34 Husky, Cayman, K-A-M-A-N. I've never heard of them.
Yeah, it's made up there in Connecticut.
Is it Sikorsky?
I wonder if Sikorsky bought them or what. I never heard of them.
Wow. So no, they were an independent company and Cayman, yeah.
Oh my gosh!
And the Navy had them first. They used them for rescue on the ships. They had that model. They had a recep engine in it, and the Air Force they reconfigured the airplane and put a small turbine on it. But in the beginning, it had a recep engine sitting there and didn't have the glass doors on the back. It had a big old R-1300 sitting there.
How much of a beast was it to work on?
Oh, it was an easy airplane. I mean,
okay.
Didn't a lot of things break on it, except that, they had an in-flight tracking actuator where you could adjust the blades, and we call it the pilot's toy, and they just felt like it had to adjust it, and sometimes the switches would break and the pilot would keep playing with it, trying to, and then get the airplane where it about to fall out of the sky, and then had to land, and then had to reverse the wires on the switch to get it back to normal. That's
Right.
the blades were, like I said, had a metal strip, but they were really mostly bossing wood. Like I said, they were just, so they could twist real easy. As you just had a rod up through the middle of it, and up through the. It was all no electronics on board, except the radio. I mean, as far as flying was concerned, it was just everything was manually controlled. Didn't have any power steering or anything like that.
My feet are numb right now, Bill. I am complete. I think I might throw up.
I had no idea. None.
Now, it was, we jokingly, like I said, when we'd been over there about 3 months, they brought in CH-3, which is Sikorsky, and used it. And we were scheduled to come home, but unfortunately, they had mechanical issues they had to deal with because of the hot weather. They get into a hover, and the transmission start heating up, and Sikorsky had to go back to the drawing board to come up with something, with that heat we had there. And so we were extended for the duration, and then, of course, later on, they got the C3s, and they renamed them the Jolly Green Giant. So as the pre-green, we were pre all that green stuff,
Okay, so the CH-3 was the Jolly Green Giant.
Yes, and then it was
okay, gotcha. And I'll try and put one of those up in a bit. But
good golly,
twin turbines. Yeah, they were great airplanes for that, in that way.
Okay, so now you just mentioned that. I have to ask: was the 43 was that a recip and not a turbine engine?
No, he said it was a turbine.
A single engine turbine. Yeah.
Oh, single engine turbine. Okay.
Yeah, when the Navy had it back in the late 50s, it had a reciprocating engine. Like I said, where those glass doors you saw there.
Okay.
That's where the radial engine used to sit.
I'm sorry, I must have missed that when I was going to get the picture when you were talking about that. So I'm only good at some multitasking, not all of it. So holy cow. So all right. So when did you get in country?
The nickname for the helicopter was Pedro. Of course, it became politically incorrect, and so we lost our name Pedro in the 60s, and then later on that they decided it wasn't a bad word, and so in fact, to be in the beginning of the Vietnam War, all the rescue missions in Afghanistan were flown under the call sign Pedro in our honor.
Right. Yeah, that's what they were flying, the 46 at Cherry Point and Yuma. We called them Pedro. Yeah. And my understanding is they've gone away now, and it's the Coast Guard of Elizabeth City that handles the East Coast pilots that get themselves into a fecal matter sandwich.
Oh, yeah.
So
no more Pedro.
They went up to the H-60, and I don't know what they got now. They're much more sophisticated. Like I said, in my day, the crew chief was the flight engineer too, because all we did was sit there in the back, and so later on, then the guys that worked on them never flew on them. They had flight engineers, I guess they want to call them. Everybody gets a title,
So Bill, it was a crew of two pilots.
We had a pilot, co-pilot, parescue, and a crew chief. My responsibility was to operate the hoist and the fuel management, I guess you might say, and the parescue. If we were picking up an injured pilot, we could actually put him on the harness and send him down and do a recovery that way, or he could attend to him once we got him in the airplane. So they were fortunate for us that most of the time the ones that we picked up were in good shape and didn't require anything but a cold beer and a dust off and go back to work.
Well, so let's talk about that. So how many? I mean, you already told us 4 hours, 4 hour mission to go to North Vietnam. So that's logistically hard. So you solve that with 55-gallon drum of fuel. How many downed aviators did you pick up?
I was on two different missions, and we picked up one, and like I said, and what we were doing, we were fine. We had three airplanes, and two of them were on red alert every day, and so we had rotating crew chiefs and pilots, and so like I said, it was a luck and draw as to the schedule, and I was on alert every third day, and we had six crew chiefs, and it took two, so we were on the rescue, every third day, and we had other missions we did too. We were actually, if they had a hung bomb, this never made sense to me, but like I said, you got to with a hung bomb, the only way you can release it is a negative G's, I guess, to get the bomb to slam back up in the airplane, then hope to fall off. And of course, they wouldn't let them do that over the enemy territory, and then
it might hurt somebody.
They'd come back to Thailand, the friendly territory, and then of course they'd have to pull the maneuver and drop the bomb. But then we'd have to go out there and take an EOD troop out and de-arm the bomb.
Oh, geez. Okay.
So we were just, on our days off, that was kind of things we did. Like I said, they brought LBR helicopters. In fact, the unit I was with in Grand Forks was about 100 miles away. Because I was picked out because we were add-ons. In other words, normally the rescue had two airplanes, and when we went into the actual rescue, we ended up with a third airplane, and so we had to have additional crew chiefs and pilots to add to the complement of the two pilot thing, and so that's how I ended up with them, and so I only went with, it was myself, and one of the pilots was from Grand Forks, and the others were from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then we had a couple from Lewis McChord, or McChord Air Force Base at that time, and so to make out the complement of the crew, we needed a number of people to do it.
Okay.
Yeah, we like I said, I think about those times, and I like I said, I was very fortunate, and I came in active duty in 1962. Actually, by the time I got to a unit. But, the conversation in the break room was the Bay of Pigs of 61, and what a failure it was, and what it all had gone wrong. And basically, it was all based on communication. And then I was on active duty in 62 during the Cuba Missile Crisis, and I got to see war up close and personal, you might say, as we prepared for it. And then I was in Korea in 63 when our president was assassinated. And then I was in Korea when we had the elections. And I remember this fellow standing up and saying, "I'm not going to send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves."
Right.
A year later, I'm sitting in a prison camp in North Vietnam saying, "What the hell did that fellow say?"
Yeah. What? How did I get here?
If we weren't going to be here, how the hell did I get here?
Yeah, how the hell did I get here?
Yeah.
Wow. Like I said, like it always says, when a politician's lying is when he opens up his mouth.
Yeah, his mouth.
Well, there's that. So it was September of 65. When did you get in country, or when did you get to Thailand? I guess
in April of 65.
So April, okay.
Yeah, I was scheduled to go back home in July.
Okay.
But because the C3s were coming in, they did not bring any replacement 43 people, and so when the CH3s had their problems, then
we got extended. Yeah,
we got extended for the duration. I was starting the 6 months of my 3-month TDY, and of course we were at that time. Like I said, the Air Force was trying to get us out there because if you stayed more than 179 days, then they'd have to give you a full tour, So they were trying to get us out, and lo and behold, I just went up there and extended the whole mess,
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. Well, I guess let's talk about that, because in one of the pre-chats, I came to understand that you weren't even heading that way that day, right? Was it when you woke up that morning?
Well, I was on standby, just
Okay.
to go. That was my day to on standby, and like I said, that we were notified. The problem being is the rules of engagement were horrible. Everything was being run from the White House. And like I said, the basement of the White House. Nobody could
Really,
make
as early as 65, it was already bad.
it was worse than bad. Because, like I said, we were on the problem was the pilot went down, and of course
Okay.
we were notified, and then 2.5 hours later we get airborne. Because they had to go through the procedure of determining that it was a legitimate shoot down. Then they had to establish contact with the pilot. And then they had to make sure there wasn't Vietnamese on the other end of the radio, and it just snowballed from there. And like I said, so the enemy had over a 2 hour head start on us as far as getting into the area. And then basically all they did is got into the area and waited for us to show up, knowing we were, and
They set the ambush. Just all they had to do was wait.
and they just had to wait it out, And like I said, it didn't take very many brains in Washington. In fact, that's what a friend of mine said, that, the beltway is scattered with brains because you're not allowed to bring them inside.
Yeah.
And but the worker bees, the guys that flew the airplanes, the guys that fixed the airplanes, we were dead serious of what we were doing, and believed on mission, and like I said, that
Sure.
and we believed and still believe we could have ended the war in 3 months if they just told us go get it and get the hell and come home. But when like I say, when you got politicians running the war and then they can't agree on anything, and and like I said, it was just I go back to what Ross Perot said in 1973. He said, "Don't commit the nation. If you don't commit the nation, don't commit the troops." Basically, and then nobody really ever. These are, I guess, what you might say, Korea and Vietnam are presidential wars. They want,
Pretty difficult concept to get your head around, huh?
Yeah, well, like I said, our sad thing that during the 50s and 60s is that we would support anybody that wasn't communist.
Right.
and not necessarily get the best leaders, and so these are the sad things that you run into, and
Well, I think Vietnam had eight different presidents in 3 years. South Vietnam, like 8 presidents in 3 years. So yeah, it was just an ass clown circus.
Oh yeah,
to put it nice. Let's take a moment here and thank our sponsor, Robbie Walling at HSI Wealth Strategies. And I also have a public service announcement for you, especially if you're a pilot. You'll be interested in hearing about this and maybe how you can put your skills to a good and wonderful cause. And then we'll hear about how Harriet got quickly on the ground in North Vietnam.
So there I was, staring at my retirement account, thinking, man, I should have talked to Robbie Walling at HSI Wealth Strategies about 20 years ago.
Oh,
I had a budget, a spreadsheet, a dream, but in reality, that's not enough, Fig.
Repeat. I've known Robbie for over a decade, and let me tell you, the guy's as solid as they come. In addition to HSI Wealth Strategies, he's an Air National Guard pilot. He's an aircraft commander in a C-130. He's sharp as a tack, and he gets us. Military and airline pilots aren't your average 9-to-5 crowd, and HSI isn't your average financial group.
Well, exactly. We're smart folks. Just ask us, right? I mean, we know how to plan a flight down to the minute. But planning a 30-year retirement, well, that's a whole different airspace there, man. And HSI knows how to navigate that.
On average, their clients end up with, get this, $1.5 million more than folks going it alone. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because HSI knows strategies that most of us were never taught. It's not about working harder. It's about working smarter. How many times have we heard that over our career, right?
And yet we insist on not doing it so much to ourselves, right? But here's the
Right.
kicker. Look, right? It's not what you save. It's what you keep. Okay? Right?
Boom.
I mean, think about it. Between taxes and timing and the unexpected, because that never happens, you can lose altitude fast without the right plan. I wish I'd known that when I started out. But
Right.
this is your chance to avoid the common pitfalls that you just don't think about without a solid financial planning background.
Right. I mean, you wouldn't fly a long haul flight without a fuel plan, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you should know that. So why approach retirement that way? Because we're basically talking about kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
I talked to a guy, he's one of my peers, who has put money in all the right places, but had no idea that he was setting himself up for like a tax meltdown down the road. Smart guy. He just didn't have the right map.
Yeah, right. I mean, Uncle Sam has long fingers that reach way down into your pockets when you least expect it. Right?
Right.
So let the professionals at HSI do what they do best so you can keep flying safely into retirement.
Yeah. Don't be a moron. Call Robbie at 214-538-7030. That's 214-JET-7030.
Or email him, robert.walling@nm.com. That's robert.walling, WALLING, at novembermike.com. Look, don't wait until your final approach to start thinking about retirement. Do it now. Your future self will thank you.
Trust us. Don't be that guy.
Don't do it. Call Robbie. So, there I was, thinking about the gift of flight and how powerful it could be if we shared it. Imagine helping a child reach the doctor who can save her life. Imagine being the reason a wounded veteran gets to the care he desperately needs. Imagine knowing that when disaster strikes, you have the power to deliver food, water, and hope when every second counts. Since 2010, PAL's Skyhope has provided over 35,000 free flights, each one a lifeline, and every single one flown by pilots who decided to step up and make a difference. Pilots just like you. If you have your IFR rating, 350 hours pilot in command in a single engine aircraft, and access to a plane, you already have everything it takes to change lives. And even if you're still building time, you can step up as a co-pilot or mission assistant because every seat matters. It starts with one flight, one decision, one life changed forever. That's right. Learn more at palsflight.org or call 888-818-1231. That's 888-818-1231 and find out now how you can become part of something bigger. PAL's Skyhope, because when you lift others, you lift yourself.
Basically, like I said, we were shot down at that particular point, and of course the rules of engagement, we had to get away from the airplane because they would come in and within 30 minutes to blow it up so that nothing on board would fall in enemy hands. So we had to get a safe area, and of course this was late in the afternoon. And
Hold on. Well, let's back up just a second, Bill.
That's new news. All right.
Okay. So
Not sleeping in the airplane tonight.
no.
we got to get the hell out of Dodge.
So you
I guess
guys,
we were going to play Marine at that point. Run.
you guys took small arms fire from above, from a ridge line, and that's where, of course, all the power
Transmission, the engine,
transmission,
everything
all
above
that.
us.
And so you guys lost power and went into the jungle. And I remember you said something about 90 feet. You basically dropped from about 90 feet.
Yeah, the cable on the airplane is 100 feet long. And the last 10 feet is painted red, so I'm holding red cable, so I know that I'm at least 90 feet off the ground.
Oh, shit.
And I think that, fortunate for us, that the air.
Were you guys in the hover at the time trying to get the pilot?
What I had to do, we had to get lower than the tree line, and I had to get the cable swinging so I could swing it over to the pilot. And by the time he got it, all these other things happened.
Oh, shit.
And we were just getting ready to bring him off the ground when we got hit. And, of course, we just, it fell like a rock. And fortunate for us, if we'd have fell on a concrete floor or hard ground, we probably wouldn't have survived. But the airplane stayed intact and didn't roll over which was great for us,
Yeah.
The rotor they were beating the hell out of each other. They had gotten out of sync, and we couldn't get away from the airplane because we might get something in the back of the head. So, and the pilot was trying to stop the airplane. It was still running, but it just wasn't running well, and rotors were still turning. And I had to get out and go around and lay on top of the co-pilot, and we have a brake on that thing, and I'm trying to get the brake pumped up enough to stop the rotor head from turning, and the pilot's trying to get the engine shut down so we can get out of the airplane. And of course, like I said, the co-pilot got a little disoriented, and he was in momentary shock, and I had to lay on top of him and release his harness because he was putting so much pressure against the harness it wouldn't release. And so we all got out of the airplane and we made it to the bottom of the hill. There was a creek there, and we were standing in the creek, and we had one radio between the four of us. This is before, like I said, we were ill-equipped, you might say. We had one flare pistol, and unfortunately we had only one flare with it, so we fired it, and it went right straight up through the blades of the airplane that was above us, and they never saw us.
Shit.
And they took a hit, and my friend, he was able to rip that 150-pound, 150-gallon tank out of the back of the airplane and throw it out. Just the human strength, and so they didn't burn up. They did make it back. They flamed out on landing, so that's how close their fuel was at that particular point. And in our particular case, like I said, we found a place to hide, and of course, next thing we know, we started hearing Vietnamese voices, and then they getting closer, louder, and more of them. And next thing you know, they identified, they knew where we were, because we were just hoping for darkness, and then we could travel and hopefully be picked up the next day.
Yeah.
But
the downed pilot that you were trying to pick up when you guys got shot down, was he anywhere near where you guys were?
Yeah, he came down to where we were and said the place was infested, and then he took off in one direction. The co-pilot took off in another direction, and I and the paramedic stayed with the pilot, and we were captured together. And
the three of you guys were.
Three of us were captured together, and then they captured the pilot that we were trying to rescue. And our
Can
co-pilot,
you say who that was?
Will Forby, Colonel Will Forby. He was captain at the time. Will Forby. He lives in Bellevue, Illinois.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
And Tom Curtis is still alive. They're both. Tom will be 93 this year. He's 11 years older than I am, so I'll be 82 in August, and Tom and Will somewhere around that age. In fact, of the POWs, right now we have 40 that are over 90 years old, and we have 12 that are 89. So we're a bunch of old farts, and no other way to describe it. But
I'm glad you are. I'm glad you made it to your 80s.
Co-pilot got his act together, I guess you might say, and he made it into Laos. And he was captured in Laos and was spending some time in the prison camp in Laos. Do you remember the Dingler story?
I don't
think so.
No. It's a movie called Rescue Dawn.
Okay.
And Dingler was a Navy pilot that bailed out, and he was a survivalist type person, and he had a survival kit in the heel of his boot and all kinds of stuff. And anyway, him and Martin, my co-pilot, escaped together in '67, and Martin was killed during that escape attempt, and Dingler was able to make it out and be rescued. And like I said, Martin is he's on panel 2 East, line 91 of the wall. So I realized how close I could be on that wall. So he was
killed as trying to escape from camp
in Laos.
In Laos. Okay, gotcha.
And then, like I said, we were once we were surrounded, and there were, like I said, there was at least 150 with machine guns to machetes, and the pilot looked at us once they identified they knew where it was, and live to fight another day. We all had a 6-shooter, and that's about the biggest thing we had. And we could have probably took out 2 or 3 of them, but would that advance the war in any way? I don't think so. And,
no, it would have not ended well for you at all.
It wouldn't have ended well at all. And we were taken into captivity at that point, and we were taken down the hillside, and basically the first thing they did is put us on public display like a prize trophy, and
of course.
And it went well until the blowhorn showed up, and then all of a sudden everybody hated us, and and you don't want to be a crowd that don't like you. They all lunged for us, and like the guards were trying to protect us. And it was a pretty sight, and of course, they didn't learn for that. They did it 2 or 3 different times, taking us to different villages and putting us on static display. And the next thing you know, all hell was broke loose. I think probably the clincher for me was coming mid-morning. They took me out, and of course we were tied. Our feet were tied together about at our ankles, and we had about a foot of leadway. We way we would walk, and we just kind of shuffled. So we call it the Hanoi shuffle, because like I said, you can only move just a little bit at a time, and then they tied our wrists together and our elbows together behind our back and blindfolded us, and that was kind of
well, that made it easy to walk.
Yeah,
especially when they take one shoe away from you, And not only are you shuffling, you got a limp too,
Yeah. Well, so how far was the village from where you got shot down?
It was probably 15 minutes.
Okay.
And then, like I said, the next morning.
And then I'm sure they loaded you in a vehicle to take you all the way up to Hanoi.
Yeah, we were there about 3 or 4 days before they, we were captured by the militia.
Okay.
And so
actually, I was being a smart ass. I assumed that they marched you up, so you did get a ride up to Hanoi.
Yeah, they marched us some. And like I said, the first 3 nights, I didn't realize I was in the same. They just marched us all night long, and then bring us back to a different hooch in the same village.
Of course.
And then, like I said, when the regular military got there, then we did some marching and some other. But to finish up, the thing that happened was they took me out and lined me up, and I could lean my head back, and I could see the crowd had gathered. And then when they stopped me, I was looking down in a freshly dug grave, and at that point, I thought my life was over.
Yeah,
and
I would think the same
especially
thing.
When someone started talking, and I could see from the shadows, the 2 guards that brought me out were standing behind me with their weapons pointed at the back of my head, and I'm looking down at a freshly dug grave, and I honestly thought, to this day, I do not know whether it was real or imaginary. With me at that particular time, it was real.
Yeah.
And, and like I said, and all of a sudden, things changed, and the 2 guards lowered their weapons, and one under each armpit lifted me back up and took me back to the makeshift cell. And I guess that was my turning point, that I knew I was going to survive. I said they had all the reasons in the world. They had the hole already dug, and the shovel sitting right there. All they had to do was just put one bullet in the back of my head and roll me over, and it'd been over. So at that point, I knew that I had divine intervention, and I believed from that point on that I was going to survive. And shortly after that, like I said, did no nonsense. We were turned over to the regular military, and I got to experience 9 days on the road, and didn't even get to sing a song, but
didn't get to play the license plate game or anything on the road trip.
None of the road trips, because you're normally blindfolded. The one thing that happened that again, the rules of engagement. Well, you could not shoot at a truck if it was off the road. If it was on the road, you could shoot at it. But if you pull it off the road, they couldn't shoot at it. But unfortunately, we got jumped by a couple of, I don't know whether 105s or F4s, but anyway, we got jumped, and the next thing you know, the Gatling gun went off, and of course, rather than pulling off the road and stopping the war, the Vietnamese bailed out of the truck and left us in the back of the truck.
So I've got a question. I got a question.
Fighter pilots are not the best shot they think they are, because they scraped the truck 3 times and missed it.
Well, that's good. But my question is, how friendly did that fire seem to you? Just, asking for a friend.
Yeah,
oh, my God.
No other way.
So you survived guys pointing a rifle at the back of your head, thinking you're going to be taken out now by our own guys.
Yeah.
Creepy.
Oh.
Well, like I said, we experienced that, and then, of course, nobody drove around in Vietnam with headlights on because they didn't need them, because God got furnished all the light they wanted because they didn't have any lights on poles. And of course, like I said, somebody, I guess one of the 130s had dropped a flare and lit up the whole neighborhood. So we were hiding in the bushes, but we were still in the road. And next thing you know, somebody plowed into the back of us, and never did put his insurance card or anything.
It's a miracle that you survived the road trip.
Crashes in the friendly fire.
Yeah, friendly fire. And then I guess the next thing that happened was that we had bombed all the bridges, so they had to take us across the river in a boat.
Ford the river. So okay,
and
boats, all right.
That's a tough experience, is laying in the bottom of a boat with your feet and hands tied together and blindfolded in the night, crossing the water. And you knew damn well that you'd be the last one they tried to rescue.
Right.
Don't rock this boat.
Right. Oh, man. Did any of them speak English?
We ran into a couple that spoke English, but most of them did not. And one of the things over the years, they didn't carry on conversations in front of us, because they didn't want us to pick up the language. So they were very difficult about the language.
Okay.
So once we got to Hanoi proper, and the guard, we were in the back of a truck, and he pulled our blindfolds off and pointed up to the 25-foot high walls there at the Hanoi Hilton, the concertina wire, the broken glass that scattered the top, and he said home, and of course, home to me was, for any guy in Southeast Asia, San Francisco, so
yeah. And
so it took me a while. I realized that we were 12,000 miles apart in our thinking, because once they pulled up to the door, we went through the first set of doors, and then they opened the second set, and then we went through there, and we were standing there, myself, my pilot, the other pararescue man, and the pilot we were trying to rescue. And when they separated us at that point, I didn't see my pilot or the pilot we were trying to rescue for 7 years.
Whoa!
Wow! They kept you separate for that long.
Yeah.
Well, they moved you around some, right? I read the summary of your book.
Yeah, they moved us around. In the beginning, they were just like, of course, those who were running the war. When I say running the war, the generals and the admirals and they believe it was going to be a short war. And but of course, like I said, the president had a different thing, and the Vietnamese were the same way. They thought they didn't want to invest in prisoner of war camps. They used this Hanoi Hilton was basically an old World War. It was a French prison that was built by the Vietnamese. And we only used about 10 or 15% of it. Kind of like the States, they have a processing center for every criminal that goes through, and then they're shipped out to the different prisons throughout the state, and that's kind of the way we were. And they were keeping as many of us there. Myself and the four of us were considered probably around the 20th shoot downs over the north, which were Everett Alvarez was the first guy shot down over the north in he was shot down in August of '64, and And then we had, like I said, that by the end of '65, there was only 62 prisoners of war in North Vietnam. Now, we don't know how many were in South Vietnam.
Okay.
Now,
And
far as
were you and the paramedic, were there any other enlisted men at that point? Do you know?
at that point, we were the only two.
Okay.
And we had another one to join us in November of '65, and there was only three of us up there for the most of the time until right there at the end. We had the B-52 tail gunners that joined us, and we had one Navy corpsman, or Navy, fell off a ship,
Right.
and he had poor navigation skills. He thought he was swimming in the San Francisco harbor, and he ended up swimming into Haiphong and got captured and was with us for about a year and a half. And he came home, and he had memorized all the names and that existed at that time. He had memorized about 500 names. It turned out that over 300 of them were good names. And he had put them in a rhythm with old MacDonald had a farm, and that's how he memorized those names. And when he came back, and he was the only one that was given direct order, if you have the opportunity to go home, to take it. And so he took that opportunity to go home at the blessing of the senior ranking officers. And
no kidding.
As a result of that, releasing those names, over 300 families got to learn that their loved one was still alive. And so these were the ones.
I knew that story. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And, this is the thing, when we all thought it was going to be a short war, and the most important thing was to memorize names so that, that
Sure.
if we were released, we could ask about him and make sure that everyone was in or accounted for. Yeah, Colonel Thompson was the longest held prisoner of war. He was captured on the 26th of March, 1974, or 64, and released on the 16th of March, 1974, 73. He spent 10 days shy of 9 years in captivity in South Vietnam.
Wow.
And we don't know how many were prisoners of war in South Vietnam because, some of them were captured and they were executed later, and some of them were executed on the spot. So there's no true number of prisoners of war that of the 1,500 still missing in action, and most of them are in South Vietnam, but that were actual prisoners of war that were executed later.
Right.
I do know of one that was executed, and as far as the North is concerned, we lost about 125 in the prison camp, and the official release number was 561, and later on, the number got up to almost 800 because we went back and picked up everybody who had been captured and escaped and et cetera, and all those things.
Okay.
And so, but right now, we just reached a halfway point. Number of prisoners of war is basically right now it's only 300 of us still alive, so we're very fortunate. Of course, the oldest guy captured in Vietnam was born in 1915, and the youngest guy that was captured in Vietnam was born in 1952. So those kids are just turning 73 this year.
Right. Is that crazy?
Those kids. How about that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Just wow.
And,
Bill, did you go to SEER school or have any kind of training preparing you for being a prisoner of war?
I just went on OJT, on the job training.
Yeah.
Well, I'm fortunate I was surrounded.
Sorry to laugh at that. Holy shit.
Well, we had a 5-minute class in basic training, where they gave us a gas mask and then come by and rip the gas mask off. And
Sure.
that was the extent of the serious training I had. And I didn't volunteer for the course after I got back either.
Well, I don't know why you could have given the course. You could have given the course of instruction when you got back.
Right.
Well, Yeah,
Holy shit.
a lot of guys did get involved in afterwards. We rewrote the rules, as far as the war is concerned and thought processes involved.
Yeah.
But no, like I said, and I was very fortunate. I only spent about between 6 and 8 months in solitary confinement, not all of it at one time, where some guys spent as much as 4 years, especially our senior ranking officers.
Okay.
Yeah, and
So why was that? Did they, because they were senior, you think they were held separate or in solitary?
well, if they could have, they would have kept us all in solitary.
Okay.
When I was in solitary, semi-solitary for 5 years. Either maybe one, and then we eventually got three of us together. But it was a while before we were in large groups. And like I said, they didn't intend to build a prison camp and actually
Right.
and so we were over and and when Robert McNamara in '66, I think he was the thing that was the saddest to me is when he said that he announced to the world that the prisoners of war were expendable. And, we kind of laughed at the dumbass. Anybody could create an Etzel and still make money. He's
Wow.
and he basically he had to come out and clarify it, because like I said, our families were pretty upset when your
You think?
the leadership of your nation declares your son, your brother, your husband, your father as expendable, and he had to come out and clarify. Well, he was just trying to get the pressure off of us so the Vietnamese didn't think we were of any value and wouldn't bother us,
Okay.
And so,
that makes
That
complete
actually
sense.
kind of
to
makes
me.
some sense, but
If they're no
So-
value, why keep them?
and
well, yeah, I
put a bullet
get that,
in
but
their head, put
in
them
other
in the
words,
ground.
he didn't want him using them as leverage against it. I mean, it's flawed thinking. There's no doubt about it. But I see the logic he was trying to use, and horrible as it was, especially for the families.
Well, he
Oh, my
wanted
God.
all the military wear he was going to save $10 million by making all the military wear the same belt buckle.
Yeah, because
Yeah, he's that fucking smart.
yeah. So as long as we're on some of the political figures of the time, there, but were you introduced to Jane Fonda at any point? Or
No,
did you not see her?
I played her in a part in a play that we put on in the prison camp, but I'm didn't actually get to meet her. One of my roommates did. One of my roommates, I won't mention his name. His mother came over with Jane Fonda, and he was released a couple of months before we were. And he went home with Jane Fonda, and I don't know if he went to her house or not, but anyway. But I give him credit. He did go back and he contacted all the people that he had lived with and let them know our status, and we greatly appreciated it. We didn't disagree with him leaving, except that he should have left with his mouth closed instead of open. And that caused a lot of disappointment.
You bet.
You had a free ticket out there, just keep your mouth shut. But
Keep the faith. You've got to keep the faith. Oh my God. Well, so you mentioned status, and so there's a story that Racket mentioned to me. You were healthy throughout, right? Except for
I was pretty good
one
shape.
little incident.
Yeah, I came down with appendicitis, and lucky I was living with two paramedics, and they instantly diagnosed me as having appendicitis, and of course the Vietnamese are it's kind of like I hate to use the word redneck, but some people don't care about their animals, and so they don't pay any attention to the animals until they quit eating. And that's the way the Vietnamese treated us. As long as we were eating, then we were fine, And like I said, so in order to get medical attention, my roommates, we had to go on a hunger strike, or Well, basically, I would refuse to eat, and then they would share their food with me. So we were getting enough food for one person between the three of us, But like I said, then we had to give up one meal so that the Vietnamese would finally notice, and they finally, after 2 or 3 days of me not eating, then they sent the camp doctor. And of course, you got to remember, the camp doctor used to be the camp driver. He went off to medical school and came back 6 months later as a camp doctor.
Oh boy,
qualified. Well, they say it takes them 6 years to train a pilot and 6 months to train a doctor.
Right.
I don't know which one I'd want to fly
You
with.
heard that, Doc? He's watching.
I probably would want to fly with him. And I really don't want a guy that only got 6 months training to operate with me either,
Right.
But like I said, they took me in and they diagnosed and said, yeah, you have appendicitis that we need to operate. I said, what happens? You don't operate. He said, you die. I said, well, that's kind of put it in a clear word there,
yeah. Well, that simplifies things a little bit.
Yeah, and I was very fortunate, Ho Chi Minh had just died, and things were starting to improve a little bit. I knew guys that had gone underneath surgery and didn't fare too well,
Yeah.
I had a friend of mine, Colonel Fred Cherry. He was the first Black American captured in North Vietnam, and they wanted to patch him up real good. And like I said, they operated on the shoulder, and of course the operation didn't go bad, but they sent him back to the room, and next thing you know is he got infected, and thank God for maggots, because the maggots ate all the infection, and he survived. And then during a torture session, when he wouldn't go home, they told him, we groom you to go home and you tell a good story. And he said, he ain't gonna tell no good story, So in a torture session, they broke a rib and punched a hole in his lung. They went in and repaired the lung, and Fred coughed up blood for 2 years, and then one day he coughed up a stitch, and they had used a non-dissolvable stitch on his lung.
Holy!
And he coughed up a stitch and quit bleeding, But that's that was the problem with most of they got some fairly decent. I don't want to say it's perfect, but it was life saving, and then they throw them back in there, we're in the filth pit, and like I said, and next thing you know, they got infections and things like that, But,
well, Bill, what was an average day like for you when you weren't in solitary confinement?
Well, you would think about a good day. I would think in a cold day, like I said, if they gave a cup and a half of water a day, and that was if they brought the water over and as soon as it hit the pot, they give it to you and handed you a cigarette and a light, and you sit there and sip warm water and smoke a cigarette. That was the start of a good day. But the next day they'd come in and they'd put the water out there and let it stay out there until it got cold, and then they'd come in and give you your water, and then they'd hand you the cigarettes, and then they'd give us 3 cigarettes today, and then they wouldn't give you a light. So now you got three cigarettes, cold water, and you say this
not a good day.
Happy day.
Oh,
shit.
Holy shit.
It just depends, like I said, and sometimes they bring the food and you could see the heat rising off of it, and you say, all excited you're going to get a warm meal, which was a bowl of soup and a side dish of another green of some sort, like I said. And then you sit there and you see all the heat leave, and then next thing you know, they use buffalo meat, for the juice, you might say, and then you see this fine layer of lard, you might say, water, and sometimes they gave us the bread or rice. Sometimes the bread, you get bread, it was nice and warm, but next time you get it, and that's how you could tell an old guy from a new guy, because when you weren't able to communicate with him, like I said, a new guy, he looked like he was on a treasure hunt, because he'd tear his bread all to pieces, and find Fred, that little fella we used to have in our bread. And we never bothered us, old Fred was always dead. It only bothered us when we found half of Fred.
Oh, man. Well, so you talked about communicating, and I asked you about the tap code. You said, yeah, you were using the tap code, and I want to ask about that. That was actually a pretty funny story at that point. But how did you learn the tap code, since you hadn't gone to SEER school?
Well, they weren't even teaching it at the SEER school. Smitty Harris. They really got into prison camp. Smitty Harris, and they has a book out on it. And Smitty lives down there. I refer to him as the other famous guy from Tupelo, Mississippi. And,
okay.
Smitty, he said he had no reason. He said they was brought up at the tail end of a class in SEER school, and next thing you know, he said, I stood over and he said, I talked to that master sergeant that was teaching the class, and we went over that, and he said, it was some reason I needed to know this, and he said, and he brought it into the prison camp. He was the second shoot down over north, actually the third, I think, but he brought it into the prison camp, and basically all it was you take the alphabet and drop the K out of it and use a C in the place of the K and square it up to a block of 25, and then and top to bottom, left to right. The first time I learned it, I learned it left to right, top to bottom. And the Constitution doesn't come out very pleasant.
I'm going to have to look that up, I'm afraid.
But luckily, when I moved from the Hanoi Hilton to the zoo, my pilot was behind me, and he recognized what he was doing, and so he tapped it back to me and said, it's top to bottom, left to right, rather than left to right, top to bottom. So I got it straightened out. And
that was Zulac, the prison called Zulac, right? Or Chulac?
I think it was. Yeah, we just called it the zoo because the Vietnamese, they brought in a few animals, and scattered around. We had chickens and we had one donkey and a couple other animals running. It was an old French film studio. Like I said, they had all this old film in there, and they had a swimming pool out down in the middle, and they had dumped all the film in the swimming pool. And of course, the Vietnamese, we were dumping our bro buckets, our toilets, in the one end of the swimming pool, and we were dipping our water out the other end. Wanted to do us all, but at least they boiled it, and they put tea leaves in it so you wouldn't get caught up on the color of it, But
gosh, repeat.
Yeah.
The thing of it is you've noticed is the reason I'm here today is because I got a sense of humor. If you can't laugh, you're not going to survive. You just keep plugging away. As like I said, our leaders understood that we were in a bucket of manure and without really guidelines. We had the code of conduct, and the only thing that they added to the code of conduct was not to sustain permanent injuries, know when to say when, and of course we each added our own. I think each event that we went through, there was one question we always had to answer, and that was to ourselves. Can we live with what we do the rest of our life? And so that was you might say, governed everything you did, as how you handled the situation and what you did. But we were given clearance, and nobody can really answer the word torture. you can holler at someone and they think it's torture. Or you can beat the hell out of them and say, "Boy, that wasn't good, was it?" So I mean, so people just, so once we kind of defined it as once they lifted a hand to you, then you had defeated them because they wanted you to give it to them willfully. And so once they had to beat it out of you, and then it was up to you and how far you'd take that. And the important thing was not to lose control, because if you lost control, you might tell them everything, and that may harm someone else. So you had to control what you said, and the key thing to it was, if you're going to lie, remember the lie.
Oh yeah, huh? I can only imagine.
And so, some guys, they dealt with it in different ways. I just stayed, like I said, I stayed close to what I would say was the truth, or to something I could remember, and some people just took up a friend's identity, and we had some guys that told the Vietnamese they were single, and all of a sudden they said, "Oh, well, I guess you don't want this picture of your wife and kids," and so these kind of to deal with it, and like I said, the good part about the first part of the war, the first couple of years, all these guys had been flying together for 7 or 8, 9, 10 years, and all of a sudden they knew each other, and that created a little bit of problem because some of them didn't like each other before they got there.
They're buddies now.
Now I'm stuck in the room with him.
Son of a bad word. Oh, man. I don't know how to ask this one, because I'm thinking the Vietnamese probably had much less of a sense of humor than the Germans. Now that's going to be saying something. We had a family friend who was a POW in World War II, and he said that they used to play, and again, you spent more time, it sounds like, in solitary, or at least as separated as possible. He said, but they would sit there and write letters home and play cards in complete blackness to screw with the Germans. Did you guys kind of screw with them without letting them know they were being screwed with? Or did anything like that ever happen, or no?
We had similar things. They, like I said, they're very rigid. They went from 6 to 10, and 10 to 2 was quiet time, and 2 to 4, and then things like that. But the weekends, Sundays was a completely day off, and we used to play run, guard, run, and they'd have a minimum shift on board, and the word report was bow cow, and somebody would holler bow cow, and knowing where the guard was, because we, like I said, that, and we get the guards running, and things like that.
God bless you.
I had one guard, when we first moved into the zoo, we had light switches on the wall. Of course, they were still hooked up to the bulb up there, and these guards, some of them had never seen electricity. And I learned the word dit. The guard came one day, he was very fascinated. He said, dit. And I'm looking around, I'm trying to figure out what the hell he's talking about. He's pointing to the light up in the thing. He said, dit. And finally I figured out. And so I went over and I hit the light switch, and the light came on. And he said, no dit. So I sat there and cut the light switch off, and so we played dit and no dit for about 2 hours. He was just totally fascinated at how I could touch a switch on the wall, and the light up in the ceiling would come on.
Wow!
So he'd come by and say dit, you'd turn it on.
Yeah, when he'd come by and say dit, I'd turn it on. Hell, if he won't play that, that's. And
okay.
And now, folks, you've learned the Vietnamese word of the day.
No dit.
Wow. So I'm guessing he was, or they were all were any particularly decent to you? And some that when you saw them that things were going to go badly?
One thing you remember about the guards, they had been directly affected by the war.
Sure.
Okay.
such as the loss of a loved one, a wife or a mother or a son or somebody. And so they came into the prison camp with a natural hate for us.
Mm-hmm.
That they built a barrier with that. And it took us a while to convince them we were human and we, me personally was not responsible for their losses. And that was the kind of thing, and, with the difficulties we went through. And then, of course, they forbid them to carry on much of a conversation with us.
Mm-hmm.
And they had some English speakers, and sometimes they try to trap us. They put an English speaker in a prison camp, and he'd never speak English, but he would just stand around like just a regular old dumbass guard and just listen to us talk, and report back. And so, and we were surprised when that happened. But
Interesting.
like I said, they did a good job. These were not professionally trained. Like I said, I went back in '95 and I met with one of the guards that had been in prison camp. He was a decent guard, and he never caused me any problems. He just did his job and I did mine. And there were some, like I said, I would have lunch with, and there's others I could take a blue tarp and just disassemble them on, and
right on. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
it just depended on. We had one guard we called Moses. We used to steal cigarettes from him. He knew we were stealing cigarettes. And like I said, you steal a couple extras from him, because he put a whole pack in there, and you steal a couple extras, then he might give you an extra one. You felt bad for stealing.
Hey, didn't you know smoking's bad for you? Come on.
Well,
Pass the time, right?
I didn't
Anything to
smoke,
pass
but,
the time.
like I said, once they've given us 3 a day, and then they upped it to 6 a day, I think I finally quit smoking, like I said. And, of course, they had good tobacco. It wasn't going to kill you, like I said, it was swept right up on the floor.
It was the real tobacco, not the kind that had the chemicals in it.
And there's not a chemical compound that we get in here. So I'm from North Carolina, so I'm a tobacco believer, and tobacco has not killed anyone. It's the chemicals that's killing us. Just ask Kennedy. He's figuring out all the
Right.
chemicals that we're putting in food and everything else is killing us.
Right on.
Food ain't
Yep.
killing us.
Yeah. Oh man. So interesting. Yeah. So that's what I was gonna ask. Were there any guards? And so it sounds like some of them were human.
Yes,
And
some of them are very
that's a good
human,
thing.
and some of them, like I said, that, like I said, that I'll tell a funny story. I don't know if it's a mixed group or not, but I mentioned that donkey the other day,
Mm-hmm.
in the earlier conversation, and the guard out there we call Zero was standing out there, and Zero, the old donkey was, I guess he was sitting there pounding his thing up against his chest, and Zero, he pulled his out and looked at his and looked at that donkey's and just shook his head and walked off. Okay. Had my entertainment for the day.
There you go. So Zero had a dick measuring contest with a donkey.
He definitely didn't win that one.
No. Oh man. So what was it like going back? You said 1995 you went back?
Yes, I was on a Vietnamese postage stamp, and those pictures I sent you is a picture of that stamp. They took that picture about 3 days after I was captured. And so later on, they used that stamp in 1967. It came out as a 2000th airplane shot down over North Vietnam in the series. They started at 500 all the way up to 4,500. Every time they shot down 500 airplanes, according to their math, then they'd put out a stamp in commemoration of it. And the 2000 stamp had my picture on it, standing with this Vietnamese lady. Yep. She was a 17-year-old kid, and so Of course, you have to remember to get it perspective. They shot down, according to them, 4,100 F-105s, and we didn't build but 623 combat models. So, they had a little bit of fuzzy math going for them, but that's a stamp right there, And
Look at that.
and that, the capture none of these, the man and the mouse, and the purpose of it was totally propaganda. They were released it to tell their females, this is what you can do for your country, and like I said, so
Too low, too slow for too long.
yeah, we got them twos involved, and she when they after the war was over in '95, Japanese public broadcasting was doing some human interest stories over there, and she talked to him, and she said that she had captured me, of course. So anyway, they thought it was a good human interest story, and they contacted the U.S. government. They gave my information, and I called Pete Peterson, who was the next district in Florida, who was a POW with me, and he ended up being the first ambassador to Vietnam. And he thought it was a good idea, and he said I wouldn't be interrupting the apple cart. Always concerned with trying to do the right thing, and he encouraged me to accept it. And then her story was I was heavily armed airman walking down a Vietnamese road, and I ran upon her, and she reminded me of my sister, so rather than shoot her, I surrendered to her, and I said, no, it wasn't quite like that. I said, I knew there were female in the capturing party, and I said, but she had 150 friends with her. They had everything from machine guns to machetes. And we almost didn't make the trip over that, but they decided, said, well, that's the way it was. In fact, I was in Gulfport, Mississippi, and I showed that a young man, he was retired. And I said, how long you been retired? He said, 3 months. He said, did the show that bad? I said, yeah. He said, and then we got to talking. He'd been an attaché in North Vietnam. And so anyway, I showed him that stamp, and he went and called his wife up there and showed it to her. And she said, I know you. I study you in history. I know you, and she was all excited. You know how they can get excited, and she just rattling up there. She took that picture to the back room and showed it to some of the South Vietnamese, and it went over their head. They had no clue what she was talking about.
Too funny. So, and that's the picture that's the cover of your book, The Longest Rescue, right? Yeah. So.
Yeah. It was made in 2 denominational stamps, and like I said, in fact, I've bought some of them in the last 4 or 5 years off of eBay.
Well, there you go. Okay. Well, so I don't want to jump too far ahead, but at what point did you realize you might be actually getting to go home? And let me back up a little bit and preview, or I don't know how I want to say it, but we had another Jen on the show, and I told you about this on the pre-chat, that was a friend of ours flying Harriers, and he was like, I don't even deserve to be in the same room with you guys who did it. And to which it was responded, you did it the same way we did. You just, nobody knows. There's no crystal ball. You do it one step at a time, one day at a time. That's how you get through this. At what point did you begin to have hope that things might be concluding and you would actually get to go home and reunite? And then if you talk a little bit about what that process was like and how much it was good and bad.
Back in '68, we had a glimpse of hope when President Johnson announced the stopping of the bombing of North Vietnam. We thought, but as time drew on, the Vietnamese changed no expression. We realized it was just a propaganda ploy, and the only thing that did to us is cut us off from the outside world. Up to that point, God bless new shoot downs, because they come in just like I did, dumb and dirt. But like I said, when you start picking the brains, they'd remembered something, and our standard motto at that time, it can't last 3 more months, we'll be out of here before Christmas. So that was kind of our battle cry, we'd hang in there for 3 months and then we'll go home, and so we had a thrill of run up our leg, I guess you might say, when the LBJ said, I'm stopping the bombing, and we were almost suckered into the same thing that American people were suckered into as the war's over, and it's just a matter of clearing up things. And then we realized the war wasn't over, because as a result of that, we were cut off from the outside world, and we were, at that particular point, we became completely expendable. And what I mean by that is that, Johnson didn't care a damn about us. He never asked about our well-being, never completed us in any of the conversations that were going on. All he was interested in was getting Humpty Dumpty elected, and that was the thing. And they sat there for 8 months and talked about what kind of table they were going to set at to end the war.
Right, the shape of the table for the negotiations.
So we ended up with an oval table in the middle of the room with 2 round tables, with North Vietnam and the United States sitting at the big table, and Viet Cong and the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese sitting at the little round tables in the corner, and that's what they accomplished, and the thing that really, I guess, triggered us to re-energize our hope is the day after President Nixon was elected, they were out there digging foxholes, because President Nixon had made it very clear that he was coming, and of course, unfortunately, we were having to read between the lines, because we went 3 years without any communication with the outside world, except for one good thing is that the International Red Cross had been, because the Vietnamese would not honor the Geneva Convention, they would not get involved in the POW issue at all. They wouldn't send care packages or anything, what they had to involve, the Vietnamese wouldn't let them involve the prison camps. And of course, the American Red Cross did send partials over there to us, but once they found them on dead North Vietnamese in South Vietnam, then they quit sending packages over, which we never got any of.
Yeah.
And then they allowed our families to send us a little care package, and that's how we found out Neil Armstrong had walked on the moon. Was in a year. You guys maybe are old enough to remember when you went to a restaurant. They have little sugar packs and the condiments on the table, and on the back side was a little bit of American history. And you could.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
And this is what we had, and that's how we found out Neil Armstrong walked on the moon with a sugar pack that was sent in one of the care packages that we received.
Wow.
And,
no kidding.
How about that?
Yeah, and so up to that point, we had read something about Russia had talked about the importance of all the stuff they had put on the moon so they could send back information, and that we almost figured it out, and then we got confirmation from that little sugar pack. And these packages, they were a lifeline, and letters, they started improving. In fact, one of the pictures I sent you today was Colonel Bud Day, and anyway, Bud had written a letter to Dory. He says, "I hope you're not feeding that damn donkey anymore." And Dory wrote back to him and said, "The donkey died."
Wow. Yeah. News from the outside world. Holy smokes.
Yeah.
All right. So 65 to 73, just shy of 8 years. When did you realize? I mean, did they tell you when how did they get you? How did they move you to the airplanes? And when did you realize you were out of Vietnamese airspace and this was no bullshit? You really were going to make it home?
Well, the first thing that happened was, like I said, we'd been labeled expendable by Johnson administration, and then a group of generals and admirals, and they got together and talked about the prison camps One of them was Sante, like I had been to. I was in what we call the Bry Patch, but Sante was the Zach prison camp. And they said there were about 60 Americans out there, and said we believe we can get them out, And so if you saw the Bin Laden raid, you saw the Sante raid. It was an exact duplicate. How they trained at Eglin Air Force Base, and once they were ready, of course, they quit flying reconnaissance missions over the area to draw no attention to it. And so next thing you know, they went in and they executed the mission flawlessly, And I mean, they crash landed a helicopter in the compound, blew a hole in the wall, and started securing the area. Got more reinforcements in there, and then they couldn't find any American prisoners of war, and those guys were brokenhearted, thinking what a failure they had been. As a result of that, the Vietnamese changed our title from expendable to high value. Shortly after that happened, the next thing you know, we moved into the Hilton complex. At that time, like I said before earlier, we only used about 10 to 15% of it. They cleaned out the whole place, moved all the political prisoners out there, and in fact, they had a female prison in the middle of it, cleaned all that out. And they moved us all in overnight. And guys were walking into a room that out of 4 years of solitary confinement into a room of 40 other guys.
Wow.
And that must have been overwhelming. Holy shit.
It was. It was 2 years before we could embrace those guys, the Sante Raiders, and tell them what they had done for us.
Oh.
For the result of their action, there was probably 30 or 40 guys that would never survive another 2 years under the conditions we were living in. They got to come home and live out their life with their families. That wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for the Sante raid. And I saw in my military at its finest, when they put us in a large group like that, they tried to identify their leader among us, and in each one of the rooms, the senior ranking officer stood up and said, "No, I'm in charge." And they went sometimes 5 and 6 deep in the room, taking out the senior ranking officers. The next one stood up, and so we won our first major victory against the Vietnamese when they recognized our senior ranking officers, and they were able to negotiate improvements in our conditions and health issues and things like that we weren't able to do otherwise. And when they kept us, divide and conquer versus putting us together like that. And so, they went at it slowly, like I said, that first they put up fences so that these 40 guys in this room could come out behind the fence, but they couldn't communicate with the guys next to them. And eventually, over a period of time, they took every other fence out where two groups could get together, and they spent their nights locked up, but in daytime they had freedom ring, and eventually they took all the stuff down. So, we saw sign after sign, but what we realized is we were starting to get inputs, and of course, like I said, I love fighter pilots, they're dumb and dirt, but they're good flying. But
he's talking about you,
I know it.
How the war was going, they said, "Can't last 3 more months. We'll be out of here before Christmas." And so we'd heard that so many times, we started to ask them questions about what the cars looked like, and they said, "Well, they haven't changed much since last year." And we said, "Hell, I ain't seen the '65 model, and here he's talking about a '71 model."
Right?
6 years behind already.
They don't have fins on them anymore. That's right? The main thing, right?
They all have seatbelts now.
Yeah. And then asked them, so we asked them about fashion, and they said, "Well, the skirts were up, and now they're going back down, so that just created another worry for us. The skirts would be back down to the ankles before we got home." But,
yeah, no, that's not good.
But we saw, we realized what was going on. That we learned that there was no standing army in South Vietnam when Johnson left office. In other words, they said, "Well, the Vietnamese are shooting us in the back. We'll take their bullets away from them." So the United States and its allies were doing all the fighting in South Vietnam. So Nixon if he'd have known what they were going to do, he could have pulled out the first day and said, okay, y'all deal with it. But he had to rebuild the Vietnamese army, and it took him almost 2 years. And essentially, as they stood up, we stood down, and then we reached the point in December of 1972 when everything had been settled. The troops had been down to a reasonable level. In fact, it was by December 72, there was about 20,000 combat troops in South Vietnam, which was about the same amount that I went in 1965. And so all the issues had been solved except for the POW issue. And the Vietnamese said, well, you just go in the house, we'll take care of that later. President Nixon said, no, we'll take care of it now. When the Vietnamese got up and walked off the platform, you might say, and President Nixon unleashed what was referred to as Linebacker 2, where in a period of 11 days we dropped more bombs than ever been dropped in the history of mankind. Not to advance the war, but to secure the freedoms of some 591. It was a number they had at that particular point. That were being held in prison camps in North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and Cambodia. And we took one day off for Christmas, but in that 11-day period, we dropped more bombs than ever been dropped in the history of mankind. Not to advance the war, but to secure the freedoms of us. And as a result of that, the Vietnamese came back to the table. And
you were serious about that.
And on the 26th of January, at the same time it was being read here in the United States, it was being read to us in the prison camps in North Vietnam that the war was over and that it would be an incremental release starting on the 12th of February 1973 with the remaining combat troops and the prisoners of war starting on the 12th of February with the 29th of March being the final day of all combat operations in Vietnam, as well as the release of the prisoners of war. And I always say that was probably the longest period of my life. Is that I understand how guys feel when they leave a combat zone and leave their buddies behind, because that was the toughest thing. I was on the second airplane out of North Vietnam. They were smart enough. It was 120 of us left that day on 3 different airplanes, 40 on each, and sick and wounded was on the first airplane, and the rest of us in the order of shoot down. And
okay,
but was that your senior ranking officer's decisions on how to exfil, or was that from our government?
Basically, the government. We just that was the way we wished it would be done, and I guess that somehow it had been communicated that we wanted to. First in, we wanted sick and wounded out as quick as possible and the medical care they needed, because there's some of the B-52 guys were pretty banged up from bailing out those airplanes at 35,000 feet, and they needed to go home and get the attention that we didn't get, but we were willing to give up our seat for them, and then it was in order shoot down, and that was the longest period of my life, is waiting for those guys to come home. We were hounded by the local press and by anybody. Everybody, they were looking for the Pulitzer Prize, and they didn't give a damn about my brothers that I had left behind.
Yeah, you couldn't say a thing until everybody was out.
And we stuck to it, too, and they called us everything but assholes. I think they did that anyway, but,
Well,
we were more concerned about them getting out than them getting their Pulitzer Prize. And so... the Vietnamese, it went so well and got so well. The Vietnamese, they went in and they grabbed 20 guys and said, come with us. And those guys said, we're not in line. They said, and they refused to leave the prison camp because they did not want to go out of order. And they had to send the State Department man in there to say, shut your ass up. Follow him. Don't screw this up. We're going to get 20 of you, And so those guys came out unwillingly, but they came because they didn't want to interrupt. And so the Vietnamese got a little bit, they were always, want to get that little bit of limelight, and they released 20 guys, and they were brought back unbeknownst to anybody, and so,
Okay. So how awesome did the Air Force treat you when you got back?
Well,
I mean, how? So did they say, we missed you. Welcome back, Bill. Here's all your back pay. Here's all your promotions. And we want you to take 30 days off and then tell us what you want to do.
well,
I'm sure that's
that was the dream.
Yeah.
that didn't happen, did it? So what was that like?
They set you up in the
I
queue
came
with
home
all
out
the
of the-
ladies and free beer and
Hold on.
See, during World War II, all prisoners of war were promoted one rank and froze for the duration. But seeing between World War II and Vietnam, it was changed for the officers, but wasn't changed for the enlisted guys. And so the enlisted guys, promoted one rank and then froze for the duration. Unfortunately,
Oh, shit.
and the officers were promoted when eligible, and luckily,
Right.
one of us up north, the two of us were single, and the other one's married, and she questioned the Air Force one day. She says, when this all started, she was a captain's wife, and I was a tech sergeant's wife. Now she's a lieutenant colonel's wife, and now my husband's still a tech sergeant. And so why is this? And
Right.
And they said, that's the rules of the road. And of course, she went public and got us promoted.
nice.
Out of embarrassment. But the problem being is, I don't know, they didn't backdate my promotion. In other words, it was only 18 months of staff to tech, but it took me 3 years to make tech, and of course that threw me behind making master with, so
Sure.
when I came out as a master with a line number for E8. But if I'd have been promoted like the officers were, then I'd have come out as an E8 with a line number for E9.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's when I jokingly refer to my commission as hush money.
There you go.
But the Air Force
Right.
didn't approve that. The Air Force, when I got back, they said, that was I went through OTS. We all three went through OTS in the prison camp. We had 2 Naval Academy graduates and 2 Air Force Academy graduates and instructors. And I jokingly say we rode on the back of the shovel like Abraham Lincoln because we didn't have a pen and paper, but we did it the hard way. But the Air Force is possibly not going to happen. And to me, that I accepted it, and all 3 of us accepted it. And the Air Force, we had signed a basic back years ago. I remember, and all of us signed the same thing. It says, "I understand that the needs of the Air Force come first." And just like you guys said, you signed the same one. Said, "I understand the needs of the Marine Corps come first."
Yep.
So,
Yeah, we're aware of that.
But at least they paid you per diem while you were there for incidentals.
they gave us $1 a day TDY.
$1 a day, baby.
They took away my $6 a day rations and gave me $1 a day TDY pay.
That's
So I
perfect.
ended up, like I said, that I got $1 a day for being Hanoi, and the guys in Saigon got $37 a day. So,
Isn't that something?
and of course,
Who's the brainchild that figured that out?
well, it's just like the first time, like I said, because I come into service in November '61, I wasn't eligible for the variable reenlistment bonuses that were available, and they wouldn't waiver that because they could have waived that and gave me a date, 30 days. So I got $1,800 in reenlistment bonuses, where the other guy that was with me, he got $36,000 because he was.
Wow.
There you go.
Well,
Actually, I'm going to ask you to tell. I don't know what story you have set aside, but I'm going to ask you to tell your communication with the officer about your reenlistment in the camp, in our little extra that we're getting ready to do. So that'll be fun. Well, I hate to do this, but we kind of need to land this airplane. We're almost 2 hours in here, and I want to be able to break this up into segments so that people can see some of this, and I can do that easily if we keep it under 2 hours. So, Fig, we'll do our, instead of just a preamble, I think we'll do our post-show thank yous and all that as well, and end the stream here, everybody. But I can't do it without saying thank you, Bill, again, for your service. We're humbled that you have joined us and spent this time with us.
Truly incredible and humbled. Thank you.
Just remember, it's one day at a time.
Right.
One day at a time.
That's how you do it. Well, okay, so everybody, I'm going to end the stream here so I can break it up and put it into segments on YouTube more readily. Thank you for your service. We'll do the outro for the audio show. Dizzy says, thank you, sir. We've had quite the audience here joining along, a bunch of our regulars, Dizzy, Badass, Doc. If I've missed anybody, I apologize. So I'm going to end the stream here.
Kind of an unusual ending to this show, but I needed to cut it off so that we could get AI, artificial intelligence, to break up the show into smaller segments so that we can put it on YouTube. That attracts more listeners and viewers to the show, so that's why we do that. So, first off, I want to give a huge thank you to all our veterans, active duty, retired, former. We wouldn't be where we are without you, and we're deeply grateful to you for all of your sacrifices in order to make your service to this country possible. Big thanks also to Dave Hamilton and Sadie over at backbeatmedia.com for supporting the show, and to our badass photographer, badass at bdsaviationphotography.com for keeping us looking sharp. Got to give a shout out to Bago and Styx, both, for everything they do behind the scenes. They are amazing show producers, and we're grateful to them for their help every week. Don't forget to grab some merch. You can find it all at sotheriwas.us/merch. We've got all kinds of cool stuff there, from drinking glasses and hats and T-shirts and hoodies and polo shirts to beach towel. Thinking of the beach, maybe a bikini. I don't know if we've mentioned that before, but maybe once, but there's a bikini available at sotheriwas.us/merch. And if you're enjoying the show, could you do us a favor, please? Head over to sotheriwas.us/rate and smash that 5-star rating for us. It really helps. It really does. The more good positive ratings we get, the more attraction we get up the chain of command there on the Apple ratings. So we're deeply grateful for any and all positive feedback. And if you want to give us negative feedback, hey, reach out to us at repeat@sotheriwas.us, fig@sotheriwas.us, Styx @sotheriwas.us, and Bago with 1G, BAGO, @sotheriwas.us. Give Styx and Bago the negative feedback. Tell Fig and me how great we are, please. We love hearing that from you. And, hey, other thing we've got to say is a massive thanks to all our donors who are keeping this thing in the air. You know who you are. Over there at sotheriwas.us/Patreon, or there's a direct donation link on our site as well. You get the extra shows that we put a little extra story in every week as often as we can so that you get to hear the stuff that nobody else gets to hear. It's our way of trying to say thank you to you for all you do to help keep the show going. I also need to say thank you to two others. Those guys. Those Gringos. 4 albums, not a bad one in the bunch. Funny stuff. If you're into aviation and aviation music, really good stuff. Talented musicians. And they've got a show coming up in Denver on June 7th, I believe it is. So thank you to the Dos Gringos for letting us use their music. So until next week, everybody, stay safe and check 6.
Well, there I was, crossing the pond, and you could see that I wasn't exactly fond of all the shit I was wearing on that day. Now an F-16 is cramped enough, but it's even worse with all that stuff supposed to save your life. But we knew there was no way. 'Cause when you're going down the North Atlantic, man, it's over.
You heard him. He said it's over.
I blame society.